Continuing from last week, I asked you guys to come up with a design for your loading panel, so let's get to work on that today. As usual, we start with a new panel and name it correctly. This instance would be a game load panel perhaps. Give it a good color, and give it a canvas group component so we can easily reveal and hide it at any time. I'll use animations to reveal and hide my loading panel rather than coroutines, so I'll be making 4 animations for that. One for revealing, one for when it's fully revealed, one for hiding, and one for when it is hidden. To start the animation, I'm just going to hit the record button, and then change my alpha value for these animations. They only need to be a few seconds long for a decent transition effect. Think maybe 2 seconds, maybe just 1. Once your animations are complete, we can jump into the Animator window and control the transitions. Notice that I'm also setting inactive as the default state, so it's invisible at start. Then I want 2 booleans for activating and deactivating the panel. These will control the transitions between the two. So let's make the transitions for these 4 animations. From any state, if I deactivate, then I want to transition to the deactivating animation to hide the panel, and if I activate, then I want to transition to the activating animation. Notice I'll leave exit time unchecked, which means an animation can be interrupted immediately to allow for the transition, and I'll just set the condition as my deactivate boolean. Then we repeat the process, but this time for activating it. Now from these animations, I'll create a transition to their finished state animations, which would be the fully deactivated and fully activated animations. These will transition once the other animation is completed. In the game, with our animator set up, I'll actually duplicate this panel now, but for our settings panel, which will be set up later for customizing settings in the game. But that panel will be disabled for the time being, because we're not going to do anything with it yet. After the animations, I set up the visual aspect of my loading panel. This was just images for the panels and buttons for the file selection areas, as well as buttons at the very top to allow me to access different files in different directories. And the alpha of the canvas group controls all of them perfectly, as you could see there. So let's look at all of these file select buttons. It's a button with 2 children, a raw image so we can show the preview of the chapter saved in it, and a TextMesh Pro object to give some data related to the save file. This way we can easily know what file is what without having to actually load it. It's important that you set both of these to not be a raycast target, so that way we only click the main menu button and not the text or image. This will make it much easier to select a file, less prone to errors. But we need to make all of this work, which means it's time to start coding. Create a main menu script and enter it. And this is where all of the main menu behavior will reside. Let's add a reference to the animator of the loading pane so we can reveal and hide it easily. And so we don't forget, let's also add an animator of the settings panel. And on start, let's make sure these panels are inactive so that way we have no obstructions in the scene. The next thing we want to do is make a command that will be called when we click to open the loading panel. This would be for the button on the main menu on that lower bar. We want to make sure the panel is actually active for this, otherwise the animations won't even work. Let's call setActive from the game object and make sure it's true. And also, if the settings panel is visible in the scene, then we want to hide it through its animator by setting the deactivate variable to true. We can reference variables of an animator through the get and set commands of the animator component. In this case, since we're using a boolean, it would be setBool, followed by the name of the variable and the value that we're assigning to it. The name of this variable would be deactivate, and we would be assigning the true value to it. But I actually think I'm going to change this from a boolean to a trigger. And the reason for that is a trigger can activate and be immediately deactivated, like a switch. But for a boolean, I would have to assign true and false every time. So I'll change the setBool to setTrigger, and this time I only need the variable name to trigger it. But this also means I need to change the variable type inside of the animator. That was my fault. Should have thought about that sooner. Let's go ahead and delete these with the delete key. And instead of adding booleans, this time we're going to add triggers. But make sure to give them the exact same name. When we give them the same name like that, the conditions are automatically remapped to the triggers of the same names, so we don't have to go and add those conditions all over again. There, and now we have the activate trigger on the load game panel to bring up our file selection screen. We'll say the loading panel set trigger activate, whereas settings we deactivate. And what we do next is actually the opposite, where we close the loading panel. Then up top where we deactivate the panel, let's just call this close function. And literally all we're going to put in here is the setting of the game object to inactive, but the purpose of placing it in a function is so we can call it from outside of the script. And repeat it for the settings panel. Then duplicate the loading function for the load panel and do it for the settings panel, reversing the loading game panel and the settings panel. So now let's head back into Unity and set the variables for this script. On the canvas or some other object, add the main menu component and then put load game and settings animators in their correct references. After that, we need to do something special to our load game panel animations. As you know, when we set our panels as inactive, the only thing that renders them invisible is the alpha value, and the canvas group becomes 0 for that. This means we can't see them, but the game objects are still active and still raycast targets. So even though they can't be seen, the raycast objects will still block the other lower parts of the UI, such as the buttons at the bottom of the screen here. So we need to make sure the whole panel is deactivated at the end of the animation. Fortunately, we can do this by using an animation event, which is the little bookmark icon in the animation window toolbar. This adds an event at the selected keyframe, which can then be populated with a certain command. What you should be aware of for this is we can't select an object or class to use a command from. Instead, we get a list of all publicly accessible events from the animated object, so the target function should be on a script attached to our animator in order to show up here. It's for this reason that I'm creating an additional script called main menu events that I'll place on the loading panels, and from that script our events will be accessed. Go ahead and select both the loading and settings panel and add this script to both of them. And before we begin, we'll want a reference to the main menu through this script, so we need to make the instance variable of the main menu. If you don't remember how to do that, you can just follow me. We'll start with a static main menu, and name it instance, and then we set it through the awake function, so that way it's one of the very first things to happen. Now we can create our function to deactivate the panels. But since both panels use the same animation, they'll use the same animation which can only link to the same event. So they will both access one function which will determine which panel to activate. This function will be close panel, and we can just figure out which one to close. The easiest way to make this determination is checking the name of the game object containing this script. If it matches the loading panel, then we close the loading panel command from the main menu. Otherwise, it's the setting panel, and we call the close settings panel command. And now we can set this function as the one called when our deactivation animation ends. So let's go back to that event right there at the very end. And select the function we just created from the dropdown. Just gotta scroll down in this list. It's pretty lengthy. We've got a lot of variables here. And it may take a little while to find, but just keep on scrolling. Should be somewhere down here at the bottom. It doesn't help that these things aren't really in alphabetical order. But, you know, can't have everything. And there it is, somewhere down at the bottom, of course. So let's select that, and now our animation will actually call that function from the script to truly close either the loading or settings panel, depending on which one is using the animation. And you can see when I select the other panel and go to that animation, the event is there as well, because, like I said, it's the same animation. So now let's go to our Load Game button in the UI and make sure that we activate the loading panel when it's clicked. In our OnClick field, let's reference the main menu, and then the function we defined earlier, which would be, what was it again? Click load, yeah, click load, alright. There we go. Now let's make sure we also close it if I hit the back button from the actual load panel. Everything's invisible, but I know where that button is, so that would actually be this one right here. Alright, on click, again going to reference that main menu. And close the load game panel. Okay, now if I didn't do anything crazy, this should actually work. So let's go ahead and hit play and check this out. Starting up. And let's go ahead and click load. Okay, that was kind of interesting. It faded in twice, but it works. And let's close it. There we go. Okay, closing and opening work, even though it fades in twice. I know how to fix that, though. I bet you that is due to our animation transition time. In our toActive transition, let's open the settings and make sure that the transition time is 0, so it's instant. This will make sure the transition is instant and should resolve our earlier problem. Do that same thing for this one up here. And now when we redo it, you can see that it works. It only fades in once. So we can open and close, but our closing is immediately. Don't know if you noticed that. And I didn't notice that at first, but it's because we're not even calling the animation. We're calling the same function that was used at the beginning to immediately set the game object to false. So close should be called at the end of the animation, but to start the animation, we should have a separate function maybe called exit, which sets the deactivate trigger of our animator, thus activating the animation, and at the end of that, close is called to close out the panel. So from the back button, let's go to the main menu and make sure that we're using exit instead of close. That way we call the animation. Start that back up, wait for that to fade in, and load. Faded in, let's go ahead and hit that back, and it faded out. And now that game object is deactivated. You can see on the right, or the left rather. So the next objective should be to start a new game file. We need to start one before we can save and load it, so let's go ahead and do that now. Let's make a function to start a new game. Make a void start new game. And one thing we'll want is a string for the currently selected game file, and this is mainly for the loading screen, but we'll give it a default value when starting a new game, maybe like an autosave or something. Just something generic. So selected game file, populate that with an empty string right off the bat. And we'll set that right here. So this value is actually the file name. And since it's an autosave, it would probably be appropriate to save it in an auto folder. So that would be auto/autosave. Just one way of organizing our files to make sure they're in good directories like this. So this is the part of the path when we get to the game files directory. And I may change this later, I don't know, but for now autosave sounds good to me. But the reason for this string is it's going to be saved to a file which will be read when we enter a novel scene. Since the main menu and novel are two separate scenes, we want to carry this over. And the value of this string will tell us what file to load, what file to save. Once the string is saved, pointing to what file we want to start or load, we need to enter the visual novel's chapter scene. And this means we need to use the Unity engine scene management. The scene management namespace allows us to gather information on scenes and even change in between them. Access the load scene function and either provide the name of the scene you want to load or the index of that scene in the game build. Reference the scene you saved for your visual novel for the name, which in my case is Chapter 0. I went ahead and renamed that to Novel, so that was more appropriate, and we need to make sure that both of these are in the build. So enter the build settings from the file header, and look at the scenes in the build section at the top. Currently it's empty, which means we have no scenes to load in the actual game. To fix this, we can simply drag our scenes from the project into this field. The first scene listed at index 0 will be the scene that's loaded when the application is launched. So we've got our scenes in the build, and that means we can load them with the scene manager. And now my novel's scene name is just novel, so I need to put that in there. And we should call this function when the new game button is pressed. That would be right here. On click, get our main menu. So put in our canvas as the object and start new game function from the main menu class. Now if we play, we should do exactly that. Go ahead and fade in, and let's go to new game. Okay, and it worked, but you may notice something in particular. And, well, the reason this crate texture is in the background is because I actually made a change to the contents of the actual game file, so it's trying to load the wrong value somewhere. But, well, we don't need to worry about that, just need to resave the file. What we should worry about is that it's actually loading the last save file and picking up the story from that point, instead of a new game, so we need to enter the novel controller in order to fix that. First things first, our file manager needs a quick change. I found that when trying to save encrypted files, directories were not automatically created, so we need to add that to the save composing bytes function. So really all we do is use the try create directory from path function before saving the file. As usual, the file manager will be available for download because there were some other changes I made as well, including the inclusion of periods with the actual directory itself. Now that our file manager is a little more happy, we can enter our novel controller. Remember that we're now starting or loading a file based off of a string or document path, so instead of using a file number, we'll use a file name. That means our file number cache above should become a string instead of an integer. Instead of 0, just an empty string. And correct the variable references down below. We also need to correct this in the save function. So active file name, don't need toString there, it's already a string. Okay, so when we first load the saved game in start, we should load it based off of the name saved in our file from the main menu, or the static string you set in a specific class. Either one works. In my case, I am loading this with the file manager. That was in the save path and the save data. And I actually want to change where I save and load my game files. I want to move them out of the resources folder and into a save folder, since these will be runtime generated documents. So that means I need to make the same correction down in my save function. With that out of the way, let's give our game a go. There we go. So as soon as I hit new game, we enter the novel scene as evident by the hierarchy view, and our console says that our active file was saved. You can come into the, since I wound up making my target directory save data and game files, you can see the folders created and the files saved inside. Also, the file was created with its directory as desired, so we now have auto and autosave. And it starts the game from the very beginning, just like I wanted. So far, so good. But one thing that should be done is we should now be able to access the game, save, and load panel from within the novel scene, and save our files that way. Currently, it's only available in the main menu, and we have to save with the S key. So to do this, I'm essentially going to take the entire save and load panel and make it its own prefab, which will be linked in both the main menu as well as the novel scene. I'm also going to make a script for this panel, so it's completely independent from the main menu, and that's exactly what we want if we're carrying them between scenes. And this script can just be placed in our save and load folder, seems appropriate enough for me. We can call this the load panel script. And I see we are actually at 20 minutes in, so we're going to pick this up next episode. I'll go ahead and release it this week so we can keep things moving, and once the main menu is done, we'll focus on building and playing the visual novel on different platforms, including Android, Mac, Windows, of course, different things of that nature. Once that's done, the series will officially be complete, with exception of a few bonus episodes for people who want to add additional features to their VN.